My name is Quo Vadis Gex Breaux, and I'm retired. And I'm from New Orleans, though I'm living somewhere else now. Well, my last real job was, of course, as the founding executive director for the Center for Ethical Living and Social Justice Renewal. We always thought it was a mouthful, and we didn't come up with that particular name for the organization. It was there when we got there. So there were members of First Church who were committed to social justice and had long wanted to have an organization through which they could do some of that work. So we started things, but prior to that, I was, and I can't remember the exact title, but the UUSC hired me to it was some kind of program, something was the title, but to work in recovery post-Katrina in New Orleans. But after a year, they said it was no longer, there weren't funds for it, or it wasn't a funding priority any longer. So we all got to work and lobbied the UUSC, learned that there were some funds in set aside that were left for recovery in New Orleans, and that's how we started the center, with those funds. And we were able to build a curriculum and build a program that was unlike a lot of nonprofits, in that the majority of its operating budget actually came from the services it provided. So we were actually not self-sustaining, but we were on our way to being that. And that was unusual. New Orleans has always been a deeply rich social and cultural city, with people living there who were closely tied to place, so much so that they lived in neighborhoods which to some people looking in from the outside might seem very isolated. For example, there were people who lived in the Ninth Ward who didn't even know how to get uptown. And some people may think that's very limited and maybe even provincial. But it was a distinction of New Orleans that people could function in their own neighborhoods. There were fewer of what we now know as food deserts. There were more services and goods available to people right where they were. And family lived near family as a rule. If you could live down the street from your mom and your grandmother and your godmother, then that was a good thing. And with Katrina, people who had never left the city, never traveled anywhere, were forced out. I remember sitting in front, we did evacuate. We evacuated to Atlanta. We were there for 6 weeks living with a friend. And every time I heard the news in the early days after the failure of the levees, because everybody now says this was a natural disaster, but it wasn't really. The morning after Katrina, we all thought, oh, great, we can go back home because everything was okay. And then the levees failed. So those were man-made levees, and they failed, which meant, of course, they hadn't been inspected properly. But here's the thing that I found most alarming, most disarming. Every time a broadcast journalist said, 80% of the city is underwater, I could not fathom it. I couldn't imagine it. I couldn't picture it. There was nothing in my mind to hold that as a concept or a reality. And of course, as I played the numbers in my head over and over and over again, I kept saying, well, where's the 20? Where's that 20% that isn't underwater? And the reality is, if 80% of anything is impacted, if the 20 is surrounded, everything is impacted. So the entire city changed based on what happened. And honestly, it's never recovered. That sense of place, culture, neighborhood. And now, for example, and I may be jumping far ahead of what you're asking, but I don't think so based on what I've read. We are living in Columbus, Georgia. My husband is one of those people who was just attached to place in a way that most people just can't imagine. And that's how typical New Orleanians are. The tether is so strong, they cannot imagine it's being broken. When he said he was ready to move, we were impacted by Ida, which happened, as you know, in August of, oh gosh, everything is running together. But it's been more than a year. So it wasn't 2022, but 2021. We moved here about 8 months ago after a pretty nomadic and scattered existence, realizing that we did not want to, after arguing with the insurance company and finally settling, we did not want to start the rehabilitation of our property at the very beginning of yet another hurricane season. So that, in addition to the reality that New Orleans is no longer affordable for most people, most middle class, lower middle class, and impoverished people are struggling to stay there. Property prices have gone up so much that most of them are just out of reach for the average working person, average family with 2 working parents. They're just out of reach. So a lot of that happened because of what happened post-Katrina, when people were systemically left out, when developers saw this as the perfect storm and opportunity to redo something before there were people there to register a vote against anything. The place wasn't populated enough for people to be heard to rule against any of these things that folks just zoomed in and started doing without popular approval. So that's getting at this systemic overtaking of a place that used to be called, I don't know if you know that, the Big Easy. Nothing is easy about it anymore. Just nothing. Between what happened to the city post-Katrina and what's happening on a global scale, but certainly domestically here in the United States with the recession and the higher cost of living in general, all that's amplified by the fact that that is more than anything a tourist culture. And that means all of those, most of the available jobs are in the service industry, and everybody knows how poorly they pay. So you get people who may have had property pre-Katrina, post-Katrina, they come back, they can't afford to rehabilitate their properties. They can't afford to live in the city. But initially, and I think this is the hardest thing for other people to conceive of, there was nothing. No goods, no services, no commercial endeavors, no restaurants. There was nothing. When we came back to the city after being away for 6 weeks, we came from Atlanta, so that's Northeast. There may have been other stories for people coming from the West. There's a point on I-10 as you're entering the city, and a very elevated point. If you're riding over that at night, what you see is a sea of light, just magnificent light, some of it twinkly, but all of it bright and wonderful, like a big Christmas tree. When we rode into the city in the middle of the night, there was a vast, dark abyss where those lights would have been. It spoke volumes to us about what we were entering. It was years before you could, at least a couple of years, before supermarkets resembled normality, before you could find a decent coffee shop, the list is so long, before any of your friends were there. I think a year after, maybe a little more, my husband and I celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary. And we said, well, let's just invite all our friends. And then we had big guffaws because most of them were out of the city. It's like, okay, this one is in Texas, and this one is in California, this one is in Mississippi. And this, because people had scattered. And because their houses were destroyed, they didn't know when or how they'd get back home. We did manage to have a gathering. Some people actually came in for it. But that was the level of devastation. And to this day, I don't think people understand I feel for the people in Puerto Rico. I feel for any place that's experienced anything like this, because it's impossible for people who haven't been there to really comprehend the depth and the breadth of the destruction, and what a slow roll recovery is. Oh, I'll tell you, I think we're all experiencing some level of injustice. And we can start with education. We have long known that minority people of color, relegated to underserved neighborhoods and communities, are not afforded the same education as those people who are able to pay for private education, or the new private public education that was allowed to happen everywhere, all over the country. And under that rubric of education, this movement now against what's being labeled a woke culture and all the representative literature there has me wondering why anyone would want an asleep culture. How is that preferable? But the point is, anytime you limit education, for some, you're limiting it for all, and everybody loses. Because again, the breadth of knowledge is reduced. It makes us less competitive on a global level because we just aren't as smart. We don't know as much as the rest of the world. We don't even want to be smart enough to know our own history. So those are some immediate dangers, but certainly economically, there's still an incredible level of oppression. We know it as people of color. We know it as women. We know that there isn't pay equity, even in the smallest of jobs. Women and people of color are always underpaid. I'm happy to see this effort now to make pay scales public. In my experience, though, people who intend to cheat find ways to do it no matter what the rules are. So it's kind of disheartening. Housing is another area. It's been proven over and over again that, again, people, poor people. I don't want to make it any more specific than that. I think anytime you have people who cannot have as loud a voice as other people in determining how things are allotted or how things are done, there is this incredible thing that happens. They're just immediately taken advantage of. Why is our society that way? So in just about every normally needed and expected service, don't even start about healthcare. I'm so distressed about what's happening to people of color in healthcare, particularly Black women having babies and dying because nobody believes they're in pain. That's a very, very specific example, but one that's very real. So, and the justice system? Who's that for? it's just so unjust, and it's systemic, and it's profound, so deeply rooted, so much so that even people who know better are blinded to it. They don't really see it. They don't understand what's really happening because we've been told that the system is just. And we have a definition of what justice is. And so we have been led to believe that the system enforces our definition of justice, but it really doesn't. It never has. Then there's media. As a former journalist, I am appalled by what passes as news and the level of sensationalism that journalists have stooped to just to get a rating point, not caring at what cost that is to the subject. And to see people's pain paraded over and over and over, it's just unreal. But this is the level of sensationalism, and then people who shouldn't have 2 seconds of airtime are allowed to suck up all the air in the room. So encouraged by much of what I see young people doing, because I believe they are stating clearly that this world they're inheriting is not the one they want to live in. I have strong faith in them to do everything they can to build the world they imagine. I regret that our generation couldn't do more and had a lot of the work we did canceled out. I guess that's how history manifests. It's a roller coaster, so there are ups and downs, there are gains and losses. Of course, we feel the losses more, and we tend to forget to talk about or share the gains because the losses are so much more painful. And in terms of civil rights and social justice, what's happening now is we see more of it, again, because of that sensationalism, but also because everybody has access to a medium and they can share what they're actually seeing. That's one of the strengths of now, but it's also one of the weaknesses, because think about George Floyd's family who had to experience that pain over and over and over again. That was one of the times I said, okay, we've all seen it. You can reference it in text and move on with whatever else you have to say. But I believe that, and the specificity you may know who's the millennial and who's a this or who's a that, but it's regrettable that so much is falling on their shoulders. And of course, one of the areas we didn't cover was environmental injustice. And we know who suffers there. And it's a global issue. Again, people with small voices, no money, end up being literally dumped on. Dumped on. So I'm happy to see young people raising their voices against those kinds of injustices and talking about real solutions, what to do to avoid this disaster we're just pummeling toward. I mean, we're just headed like a missile toward environmental disaster. As I explained, that 80-20 ratio was, and the failure of the man-made levees. Let's remember that. The storm itself had passed. The city was going to be able to operate, but the force of those waters on those levees broke them. They should have been able to sustain that. That's how they were supposed to be built. But that didn't happen that way. And neighborhoods were lost. Familial connections were broken because people were splintered. They were sent everywhere. The culture suffered. I remember one of the first deaths I heard about just broke my heart because I think it was the culture bearer and they weren't able to get out of the city. And I just think many of the things that were broken were never fixed. They were beyond repair, particularly with the kind of recovery the city experienced with culture and capital vultures just coming in, knowing there would be federal dollars and ravaging the city. They tore down perfectly good public housing that we used to have exact numbers in our curriculum, but I'll do rounded numbers as I can remember them, that housed about 4,200 to 4,500 poor people. They could have been easily repaired, updated, whatever, given the opportunity with their being empty. They were torn down and replaced with housing that had maybe 1,200 spots reserved for poor people. You can see immediately the disparity in numbers. So these are the kinds of things that impact a city well beyond the initial years after a disaster. And right now, property values are so high that people who owned property and are trying to hold on to it can no longer afford the taxes on the property because of all this gentrification. It's as though the world said, oh, New Orleans, yeah, we know, wonderful place. Let's go. And it was a boon in many ways, but it really hurt a lot of lower income local homeowners who could not match those prices and could not pay those taxes. So all of these are after Katrina repercussions. Fight the lies. Fight for truth. I think we are all buckling under the weight of the lies that are so prevalent right now. I'm just utterly amazed at the things people say that are actually fact checked and proven false, but continue to fly around as truth. So I believe when people insist on having the truth told, they can then find a way to build on that truth, to make a better place for everybody. I really hope that young people fight for truth in media. And I can't stress that enough, because I think this movement toward alternative truth is more damaging than almost anything we've experienced. And that's on a global level as well. It's not just happening in the United States. Everybody's doing this alternative truth business. But I think if people understand what's really at stake when somebody says they're going to either give you something you don't need or take away something essential. And we need to fight to keep those essentials. And we need to prioritize them over those non-essential things being pushed at us. And these are things that young people can recognize and fight against. And we all know what's essential. That list that we went down about what areas are impacted. And they're all the things that impact the quality of our lives. It's so important that we protect that quality of life and the right to have social exchange with people on an equitable level, so that you're not having your life experience cheated by not being able to fully get to know somebody else because you're buying the lies. I think it's so important that we value each other's humanity.